So now to turn to our session for today. We're thrilled to welcome Alejandra and Francisco from Puerto Rico to talk about Puerto Rico since Hurricane Maria. We're asking the question, disaster recovery and economic opportunity for whom? And Alejandra is the Executive Director of Resilient Power Puerto Rico, a role that she's had for quite some time, and previously was the Chief Resilience Officer for San Juan. And Francisco Rodriguez Fraticelli has been the Executive Director of Coalition of Coalitions since 2003. It's an organization that has a presence in all of the districts of the island. So welcome to you both. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And what I would like to do to get us started is to ask you each, Francisco, maybe you'll go first, to tell us a little bit about the projects you're working on with unhoused persons in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Justin, for this invitation. And this is, for me, it's a great opportunity to share our experiences dealing with the situation with the homeless persons in Puerto Rico in the middle of disaster recovery processes after Maria and the earthquakes and now COVID. And this is a great opportunity for me to share this knowledge and experience. Thank you so much. Coalición de Coalición is born from my personal experience being having experienced homelessness 20 years ago. And my response was to create this instrument called Coalición de Coaliciones to create the basis for the policy change and developing programs and services for the homeless, especially not only in housing, but also the supportive services this community needs in order to overcome their homelessness. The first thing the most important tool I have at this moment is data. I consider myself a social scientist, a researcher in Puerto Rico as a planner because I am a social planner. I have a master's degree in social planning in Puerto Rico. And even though I was an educated person, I went through the experience of homelessness, breaking out the stereotype that the homeless person is somebody that with mental illness or substance use conditions or is not educated. So I am presenting another face of the situation and trying to understand the whole phenomenon out of the stereotype we all know. On the other side, so using the data, I am the lead agency from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development project called Homeless Management Information System. That is a internet-based data collection system to collect a whole record of biosocial conditions of the homeless persons, not only to know about their needs, but also to plan for their services. And this is also a reporting instrument. It is designed as a performance measurement tool to report to the Congress the advancements in dealing with homelessness in Puerto Rico and nationwide. And also as an individual organization, we can see if the organizations are doing what they are supposed to do and how are we moving ahead to deal with the homelessness situation in Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
There's so much I can say, but let me.
Yes, we'll just get started. So Alejandra, maybe you'll tell us a little bit about Resilient Power Puerto Rico's work around renewable energy and climate adaptation.
So Resilient Power Puerto Rico is an organization that was born out of Hurricane Maria. We'll hit our 5th anniversary this year. And the idea was a group of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora try to identify the more immediate catalyst to support Puerto Ricans initially through the distribution of panels across community solar panels. But as we progressed, we partnered with existing service providers. So the community center in Puerto Rico is the place where everything happens. And after Hurricane Maria, these were the places where mutual aid projects started to emerge in response. And the majority of relief operations were being deployed from these centers. So we started solarizing these community centers and trying to support their path towards becoming resilience hubs for their communities. We've installed 42 solar energy and storage systems across the island, and we're currently partnering with service provider networks, including Coalición de Coaliciones. So Resilient Power Puerto Rico's work is to support strengthening the resilience of community-based grassroots organizations across Puerto Rico that are doing all of this mutual aid work that is so crucial to not only disaster recovery, but also climate adaptation and laying the foundation for sustainable and equitable development. That's it for now.
Thanks. So I think now you wanted to share a little bit, to give some context, Puerto Rico by the numbers, or in numbers as we were calling it, just to make sure that everyone has some of the background and key data to approach this topic. So great, your screen is sharing, that's terrific.
We're almost there.
Looks like we're there.
Cool. Let's try this. We're good. So when Justine invited us to work on this topic, as a resilience practitioner, I worked with the 100 Resilient Cities project in San Juan for 2 years, and the NDRC in Puerto Rico for 2 years prior to that. I know that the frameworks are all about leveraging this process of disaster recovery for economic development as well. But I thought it was important to question the premise as well, because based on the experience we're having in Puerto Rico, this economic opportunity isn't materializing with a great deal of equity. So we just wanted to give you a sense of what the situation is in terms of our climate vulnerability, but also a little bit of what's happened post-Maria. I'm going to try to be very quick with this. We wanted to give you some context. So located in the Caribbean, for Puerto Rico, climate change isn't a future existential threat. It's our current situation. 33% of all Category 5 storms over the past century hit in the last 20 years in the Caribbean. With the 2017 hyperactive season, we had 6 major hurricanes and 17 storms, and it was the costliest on record, with more than $280 billion in damages. Over the past 10 years, we've seen more frequent and more severe droughts, tropical storms, flooding, and increased sea level rise has caused significant coastal erosion. Also within the risks in Puerto Rico, we have landslides and of course earthquakes, which we hadn't seen in our lifetime until 2020. Specifically, Puerto Rico has more than 520 kilometers of coastline. 520,000 people living in the floodplain in a more than 500 kilometer coastline, and 10% of the population lives in landslide areas. More importantly, when we map these risks out, there's very little amount of Puerto Rico that isn't under high risk. So it challenges traditional premises regarding relocation as the primary mechanism to reduce risk for high-risk communities. Puerto Rico is also located in a high earthquake activity. So earthquakes have now become more frequent since the 2020 events. Now, aside from our exposure, this is our climate vulnerability is exacerbated by high susceptibility to impact once these disasters materialize. with Puerto Rico having more than 4 times the proportion of full-time workers living under the level of poverty than the US. And prior to the pandemic, median income to rent ratio was about 30%, but we've seen an increase in rent prices that exceeds 25 to 50% in some communities after the pandemic. The income levels and other socioeconomic conditions really tell only half of the story in Puerto Rico. What many climate vulnerability frameworks and in these applied policy contexts fail to grasp is the inextricable link between our development models, capital, and the patterns of exclusion that have led low-wage workers from the countryside literally create their own land over water in different wetland areas, in this case, along the shorelines of the city of San Juan's estuary, which were otherwise deemed unsuitable by the higher income communities, and left them exposed to the impact from the convergence of flooding, unsafe housing, and inadequate flood infrastructure. This really set the stage for the thousands upon thousands of families that were left without rooftops in 2017 after Hurricane Maria, in communities where there were already severe scarcity of safe and affordable housing. This destruction also happened against the backdrop of a significant number of NIMBYs, which are located nearest to our most vulnerable and underserved communities, and the consequent environmental disasters that we've seen in those settings. And continued divestment in infrastructure because of austerity measures that have left us not only with a poorly maintained power grid, but also 50% of schools across the public school system are deemed to be unsafe, as was ascertained in evaluations plus after the earthquake. In the city of San Juan, we were able to overlay exposure and sensitivity, and what we found is that indeed the high-risk areas saw more significant proportions of vulnerable populations than the averages for the city of San Juan. And the trend also held true when we compared no-risk areas to multi-risk areas. Now, in terms of recovery post-Maria, following the hurricane, Puerto Rico endured the second largest blackout in history with more than 3.2 billion consumer hours. When looking at the data regarding power restoration, the proportion of consumers with power restored differed significantly from generation, with more than 45% of Puerto Ricans still without power on New Year's Eve. 4 months after the storm, 30% of the population had still not had their power restored. The collapse of our transmission and distribution system and the rugged terrain proved a challenge during the restoration process. But when we overlaid the restoration for that final 30% over a map with CTs according to the proportion of population under poverty levels, what we found is that those communities with the highest poverty rates and geographically isolated communities in the rural mountainous area were the ones that saw their power restored last. Additionally, despite overwhelming popular opposition to fossil fuels in Puerto Rico, which in 2011 had paralyzed the construction of the gasoduct cutting across the central mountainous areas, there has been significant reinvestment in fossil fuels and specifically in natural gas. And that same centralized system that they've been reinvesting in saw 67% of its capacity crippled by the earthquakes in early 2020. We've seen no improvement in the stability of the system upon the transfer of the transmission and distribution to a private operator, with frequent and extended blackouts and accidents throughout the island. Additionally, we've seen that post-Maria, there's been an increased interest on the islands and the flurry of federal funding that's entered Puerto Rico. which coupled with relatively low prices have led to a massive increase in external investments in tourism development. According to the Center for Research Journalism, CPI, the number of permits granted for coastal developments in 2021 was 2.4 times the level in 2015, with an increase of 29% between 2020 and 2021 alone. In urban areas, these investments have focused on short-term rentals, which the CME estimates increased median rents by 5% for every 10% increase in the number of units in these communities, displacing local workers and limiting the availability of safe and affordable housing for vulnerable populations. So the idea is now we'll talk a little bit about the proposals, but fret not, there are indeed a significant number of grassroots community-driven proposals across the island, ranging from Casa Pueblos energy insurrection to Armonía de la Montaña agroecological food security co-op, the ever important work of Coalición de Coaliciones with the unhoused population, and Resilient Power Puerto Rico supporting these groups as we can by providing these solar energy generation and storage systems. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks. I think you can stop sharing your screen. There we go. And I am going to bring, let's see, you and Francisco into the spotlight, if I can do that. So now I'd like to ask you both, I think, well, let me just reflect for a second. It's really striking to see those numbers and to understand the context, you know, both before and after the hurricane event and the motivation for your work. So now what I'd like to start with is we're 5 years out, approaching 5 years out next month from Hurricane, or 2 months, Maria. And there have been massive blackouts, earthquakes, and we've had a pandemic, not least of all. So I'd like to ask you both, how has your work evolved? And with that, how does your current work compare to the initial post-disaster response, or has it changed?
You go ahead, Alejandra.
Yo primero, dale.
Sí.
Well, as an organization that didn't have a presence prior to Maria, I can compare like what the initial response was. It's very relief, very small scale, and focused on the immediate deployment of these resources for the communities. And as we've continued to grow, we've started emphasizing two things. Number one, we're trying to develop models that give us the economies of scale to really challenge and compete with the alternate models of both reestablishing the grid, but just overall climate adaptation. So for example, we support decentralized, distributed, renewable energy. So we are not an organization that just frankly supports the growth of renewables in Puerto Rico. Our work is really at the convergence of renewables and climate adaptation with equity. And in that respect, we are supporting the proposal by Queremos Sol, which is to initially focus on the deployment of solar energy on rooftops. In order for our work to compete with proposals such as solar farms, so centralized renewable, we're trying now to figure out how we shift from individual community centers and hubs to a more collectivized mechanism for the implementation and administration of these projects. And RPPR's proposal in that respect is for different interest groups, and it's part of our collaboration with Francisco to start developing their own mini utilities, whereby they can, following the Casa Pueblo model, provide energy to their members through solar rooftops, and then reinvest their margins in operations and maintenance, but in further development of projects. So this is what we're exploring right now. The other bit that changed was we became increasingly aware of the huge data gaps. So for example, both the data set comparing the restoration, generation, power, this graph, that's 1,800 data points from newspapers, official communications from the government that we brought, that we created as a data set just for people to really understand the magnitude of this event and how it was unequally distributed. So then we created that data set on which communities were in that final 30% and how the process of restoration progressed. So we're also focusing on ways in which Resilient Power Puerto Rico can increase climate adaptation capacity in these different organizations so that they can increasingly develop these proposals and projects on their own without needing us to be a part of it.
In terms of homelessness, our experience and challenges. First of all, the destruction of the housing stock by Hurricane Maria was one of the biggest challenge. So our first response was to survive the situation. So you had to go out to the street to provide services, especially to provide food and water and some supplies, some medical services. The medical services are stopped completely, and the homeless population are in constant need of different kind of health services, mental health, substance use. All those services interrupted in the middle of the disaster is another disaster in itself, because these persons depend, their stability depends while in the street, that these services are available constantly for them. So that was the basic challenge. In terms of the infrastructure, like I was saying, the past three disaster, the hurricanes, the earthquake is in the area that I provide services in southern Puerto Rico. At least 14 municipalities out of the 54 suffer severe damages in their housing and general infrastructures. Did you see one of the earthquake images from Alejandra's presentation? It was a school. Can you imagine? That was good because we were still, that was January 7th, 2020. So, and we were still in the Christmas holiday season. So can you imagine that school with children in active use at this moment? So that was a huge warning sign for us of the danger of the situation. These are education structure built with federal funding and supposedly under federal standards of construction standards, and they were not at that time they didn't consider important to build, thinking about our vulnerability in terms of earthquakes and other national disasters. So we sort of live like in this bubble that we try to ignore all these vulnerabilities, because ultimately the decisions are made based on funding and economics and how much it costs. Our economic decisions and everything that is added is erased from the formula. So the challenges now after Maria and after the earthquakes and the other challenge that can be considered positively, is that at least for somebody that looking from outside and not understanding the dynamics, is that Puerto Rico have lost at least 15% of our population in the past 10 years. And the homeless population is not strange in that. So we have lost homeless population for many reasons. And migration is one of them, and looking for services outside Puerto Rico, and housing options in other cities. We can have this sense that the homelessness is the situation is being worked with, and we are resolving, and the situation is under control, but there's not. The other challenges are the change, the fact that Puerto Rico is building. We receive over $100 billion in funding just for recovery from CDBG DR funding, and that huge historical amount of money opened the opportunity for many good people, but also for other people with other interests, and open the opportunity maybe to some predatory practices in terms of buying properties and displacing communities, especially in very high value properties and land. And as an island, we have a limited resources, that one, and especially in the coastline, like Alejandra was saying. So at this point, we are facing the big challenge of finding affordable, decent, and healthy and safe. That's the HUD's motto for housing. It's very difficult to find affordable housing to place people in house because of the market is very high, because of their limitations there, and also because there's a big, after Maria, there's being a big boom of these Airbnbs, short-term rentals, and that have moved to an increase, and a very double digits increase in rents in most of the parts in Puerto Rico. So this is one of the biggest challenge for me, even though I've been receiving and Puerto Rico's been receiving a lot of assistance, federal assistance to help these communities. I tripled my budget for rental assistance, for example, and to provide rentals for homeless persons. We don't have the stock available to house them. And on the other side, homelessness due to their vulnerabilities are they don't, homeless people not only need housing, but also need services. So it's not an option to develop housing in rural areas for homeless, because they are so far away, because we don't have the goods transportation system for them to move to get health services. And so the developments in the what we call the main street, or the cascos urbanos, the downtowns, we have so many municipalities in Puerto Rico, or local units of government, and each one have this little traditional Spanish style square in the middle with the church and the mayor's office and everything in the middle of the town, but they are not the options for the development. So one of the challenges, myself as a leader, as a person that live with this situation and now have this instrument I call Coalición de Coaliciones, to turn myself into a community developer, housing developer, in order to use that funding appropriately. Puerto Rico have, at this moment, for example, just in the past 6 months, have been allocated more than $100 million only for housing for the homeless. But the private developer doesn't know how to handle. They are going to build a standard housing unit whenever they want to, without asking us for their needs. So my challenge, and I accept this challenge at this moment, I'm working on that at this right moment, is to turn Coalición de Coaliciones into a community housing developer. So we can use this funding. I am trained as a community housing developer because I provided technical assistance for HUD in the 90s to this concept they have in the home program, community housing development organizations, CHODOs. And so I have the knowledge. I never have done it before because I've been helping other organizations to build housing in the past 20 years. But at this moment, I realized that the only option to really take that opportunity and turn it into a good project to help this person is to turn Coalición de Coaliciones into a housing development and using all this support like Resilient Puerto Rico to build also the capacity and the resiliency for these families to face any disaster in the future. Alejandra, or just think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
wanted to add that our problem with the housing stock is so severe that our other partner in this project, one of the leaders among the other partners, could not participate in this because they had to move from where they've been living for 12 years. And that network, which is a network for survivors of gender violence, they have the funds to provide transitory housing, but there's nothing in the market at the right price range for them to be able to provide this housing for the victims of gender violence, which means the shelters are now overcrowded because they have no kind of way to come out. So it has, you know, we can imagine the effects on increased cost of living, and it feels and it sounds similar to what's happening in cities around the world. But the magnitude to which it's happening and the context of inequity, right? Someone in the chat mentioned second homes. The people buying second homes in Puerto Rico right now are leveraging a significant income differential between Puerto Rico and the US, right? Median income in the US, over 50,000 for sure. I think it's nearly 70 if I'm not mistaken. But for a family of 4 in Puerto Rico, it's approximately 21,000 per year. So when the market gets distorted to satisfy demand from markets where incomes are 3 and 4 times what they are here in Puerto Rico, then it makes our work very, very difficult.
Yeah. Most recently, I was granted, I challenged a regulation in Puerto Rico, funding source from the CDBG DR program, HUD's program, and they open a request for proposals to help communities put together a resiliency plan for disaster. And I challenged the request for proposal, proposing that my community are not geographically defined like a town or a community geographically defined, but that my community share a vulnerability in the whole island. And they accepted my challenge, and I was granted funding to initiate the process to put together the Puerto Rico homeless resiliency plan, the resiliency recovery plan for Puerto Rico homeless population. So, and this conversation with you and Alejandra and these leaders, we are sharing as collaborators, and the idea to turn Coalición de Coaliciones into a housing developer is because we need the only option we have at this point, because our support from the local government is so scarce and so symbolic sometimes, just words and promises, when in the action they are not really doing something. We depend, remember that, well, you don't have to remember that. The fact is that what that was one of the things I discovered when I was homeless, that we depend completely in Puerto Rico in terms of policy and funding to deal with homelessness, because the government of Puerto Rico doesn't have any policy or funding available for homelessness in their budget. So we have to, I moved to the federal government and try to understand and turn myself into what is called a community expert on these regulations and started bringing this funding to Puerto Rico in 2020. In 2000, Puerto Rico didn't have access to over $25 million a year because nobody knew how to put together the proposal. I learned how to do it, and I've been bringing that funding every year for over $100 million to develop housing for the homeless in Puerto Rico. And currently in the 54 municipalities I provide services, we from zero in 2000, we have over 160 projects for homeless developed by this huge funding. But again, we have to push the system into developing what we need, because otherwise, if we are not on the table, the services and the planning and the developments are not a reality for the homeless, because they still thinking about general population. And when we think about homelessness, we also think about the very low income families and individuals, because they are in this breaking point where tomorrow they can be homeless. 60% of the population that are coming into the system right now, the reason for homelessness are economic reasons, unemployment, and 51% of the population, that was a recent point in time count done in March 2022, very recent. 51% of them are homeless, are experiencing homelessness for the first time, and for economic reasons. So we, as a leader and Coalición de Coaliciones, we need to have what I call a double-pronged planning process, because I need to strategically develop and try to have the services for those very vulnerable. 62% of the population, 68% of the population show very high index of vulnerabilities because of their long-term homelessness, disabilities, mental health, substance use, etc. So we, Coalición de Coaliciones strategy is to keep and increasing services for those very vulnerable people that are dying in the street because of their long-term situation. And at the same time, developing strategies to those families, as a prevention, first of all, trying to prevent that they end up being homeless in this very vulnerable situation, and also and be ready to have services available for them to take them out of the street as soon as possible, and including the situation that Alejandra just mentioned about domestic violence that by law are also considered as part of the homeless population. So we receive calls all the time looking for housing, trying to escape, because the law, the funding and regulation let us serve those at risk, at imminent risk, and at risk and domestic violence. A family does not have to wait for the domestic violence event to happen in order to be assisted. So once this family have the sense that they are in danger, that they are in an imminent danger, they are eligible for services, and we are trying to serve them also.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think we're tight on time already, incredibly. And I want to ask you both one more question that I'm going to try to combine a couple of things that have been themes. To take us back to, the disaster of the hurricane, but also the larger social context. What do you see as the models emerging in terms of leveraging disaster recovery for community development? And then I'd like to add to that, if I may, what do you know now? What have you learned in the last five or more years that can shape your future work or shape our future work?
Alejandra, go ahead.
Kind of Sorry, Justine, would you mind repeating the first question? I lost you there for.
Yeah, sure. I was asking about the models that are emerging from disaster recovery that we can leverage for community development.
I think there are, like, I have these little nuggets of lessons that I've accumulated over the past 5 years. Some of them seem obvious, but they weren't at all to us when we started this journey. The first is that we need to collectively understand what solutions are better executed in a centralized fashion versus a decentralized fashion. And by this, I'll use as an example the situation with the TARP and FEMA after the hurricane. And there were, I think, 20,000 TARPs in Puerto Rico, but we ended up with something like 750,000 homes with severe impact from the storm. So there was some aspects of the planning, and it led to the famous quote by Trump saying, "No, it's surrounded by water." And although he seemed to be like particularly uninformed when he said that, in reality, his surprise reflected the federal government's own kind of having approached Puerto Rico like we were part of the continent. And so we were thoroughly unprepared to respond, and it took 2 to 3 weeks to really start articulating that centralized response. In the meantime, all of these community centers were already deploying supplies, hygiene, medical services, services to aspirate. So where in the spectrum, and not all responses are better decentralized. But certainly understanding what needs to be decentralized and having those resources in the right hands and available to, in the hands of the people with the expertise in these communities is crucial. The other bit is, and I get asked a lot, like, how can we be allies? How can we help? How can we support? And my answer to this, I currently summarize as invest in Puerto Ricans, not in Puerto Rico. Okay. So I think if anyone is developing a project or a program, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, et cetera, and Puerto Ricans in that project are either beneficiaries, clients, labor, but they're not partners, they're not thought leaders, they're not drivers of those projects, then the likelihood that these projects are actually going to respond to our local climate adaptation needs is 0 to none. Okay. I think centering on these leaders at different scales, like there are people who run national level organizations, there are far more like neighborhood leaders, but focusing on the ideas and the projects and the programs that are already working, which we're seeing that are working, will be far more effective than attempting to implement strategies in Puerto Rico based off of more like abstract notions and frameworks and experiences in contexts that don't necessarily apply here. So those are my 2 big lessons.
Thanks. Francisco?
Yes, my biggest, it was connected with my previous response that we need to develop consciously about these realities and learning from others, agreeing to leave out our egos or competitions, because we need to collaborate with each other. When Alejandra and myself talk about this collaboration, I saw another dimension that we need to get involved. When we talk about homelessness, we have to talk about climate change. We have to talk about environment. So we have to make sure our houses are not only safe for them and healthy for them, but also they need to have a place where they can resiliently survive future disasters. So this is the big lesson we have learned, that we have to make sure all these things are in the equation, that we cannot leave these things out of the equation when we're thinking about housing and services for the homeless.
Thanks. Thanks. I see we have a few questions. I'm going to post this one, if I can paraphrase it, because we have a few more minutes. Let's see. About the financial model for transition. We talked a lot about, go ahead, Alejandra.
So there's a few, like, there are several different models which combined we think will make a difference. Queremos Sol has done a study, and over 50% of our needs from residential units could be satisfied through rooftop solar energy. And in that context, what we support is a kind of a diverse portfolio of kind of a combined portfolio of grants, loan loss reserves, low interest loans, and then a more like market level loans, depending on what the financial capacity is. So that's part of it. Part of it will also be, I think, because it's the model we're supporting, is creating these collective projects for solarization, so that we have both the opportunity for kind of social impact investment, since the model in Adjuntas from Casa Pueblo was essentially bringing together all of the business people that were around the town square initially, and they created this solar energy system, and they're actually selling the electricity. The owners do not become owners of the system. So social investment on these types of projects, kind of these mini utilities, I don't have a better concept for them, could occur with a combination of social kind of impact returns, but also some return to that investment that is lower than what you would expect in the market. I think another part of this will have to do, and we are starting to kind of get our feet wet there, on the supply side of things. So how do we help the solar and renewable energy green sector in Puerto Rico, these small and medium businesses, grow and evolve? So investments also in helping them, for example, create co-ops for supply and distribution of their materials, providing loan loss reserves or other equity so that they can participate in the federal funding process will be key as well, because we need to definitely reduce the price of these systems. Right now, the type of system that we have in the building that Francisco is right now, that's nearly a $30,000 system, although it's you know, not the biggest system. It's about 6 kilowatts. So it's not really something that half of our population or community-based organizations can afford. We really need to, you know, both find kind of this diversified portfolio of funding from grants to loans, but also find different mechanisms to lower the price of these systems and increase supply. There's a question about the colonial issue that I think is like another seminar, but I don't want to not acknowledge that the question has been asked. For sure, the colonial relationship significantly affects a lot of these trends and how these things are happening. And there is no doubt that the energy insurrection and proposals whereby renewable energy, rather than being provided and sold, is owned by these communities, are projects that significantly advance our path towards decolonization.
And the question of self-sufficiency from, especially in the energy and our political reality, is that I see this influx of funding. I feel Puerto Rico more and more mortgaged by the federal government because they are investing in housing, they are investing in infrastructure. So how can we oversee? That's a huge question we have to resolve in order to deal with this decolonization in Puerto Rico, because our dependency is higher now from federal funding and outside. And on the other side, communities are really participating. The Puerto Rico communities were the first and ever responders to disasters, so they learn that they cannot depend on the government to survive the disaster. They are taking, in a lot of communities, they are taking charge of their situation and trying to solve the situation because they know the government. And remember, we have this situation with corruption and using of funding in Puerto Rico, so they are not trusting some sectors of the government, and they are doing it themselves. In terms of the homeless population, that's part of the plan. I need to sit with them in the street, in the place they are, in order to get their sense and their needs to understand their lives, and whatever we develop is connected with their reality.
If I can
Thank
add
you.
just something very briefly, I think when we are working with high proportions of low LMI populations, access to capital is seen as one of the mechanisms for, for increased resilience and to lay out kind of sustainable and equitable development plans. But I would ask for prudence in thinking that just kind of establishing loans, for example, for solar, is the solution for these populations or these organizations. With the levels of low income, the financial uncertainty, the displacement of communities, the proposals that solely focus on people getting loans for solar system, I think, are somewhat misguided. First of all, there's no actual replacement of your electricity bill with a loan, because the fixed payment of a loan over 25 years is something you can't alter, whereas you can alter your energy efficiency, your energy consumption in response to changes and shifts in your income levels. Second, we are seeing a lot of displacement in these communities. So once you install a system, if the person is then displaced, they can't really take those systems with them. This isn't an asset that they can easily resell or kind of recover the money. And the types of loans that we're seeing in the market here in Puerto Rico are literally tripling the cost of these systems for these families. So if anyone is like looking to support investments in increasing access to capital, we really have to think creatively about what the correct financial instruments are, and how we kind of mix up financial instruments for wealthier or business kind of focused communities and these LMI communities.
Thank you both. I think we're at the hour, so I want to be mindful of the time. Francisco and Alejandra, we've learned so much from you today. I feel like we could just keep going for a few more hours.